LeahSchade is an author, preacher, and professor. She is assistant professor of preaching and worship at Lexington Theological Seminary, and she's also an anti-fracking and climate activist, a community organizer, and an advocate for numerous environmental and social justice issues.
Hello, everyone. This is Trip, and we are here again for another session in our online summit looking at the future of spirituality. And I have here the Reverend Dr. LeahSchade. And I'm pretty excited because not only do I enjoy talking to her, but she is regularly engaged with people wrestling with all the change that's going around, both invested in time and research with clergy, with congregations, denominations, but also with all those choosing to pursue theological education at this point in her work at the seminary level. So I'm super excited to gain her wisdom and then the voices that she's woven together in her research. So thank you so much for being here, Leah.
Trip, it's an honor to be having this conversation with you. Thanks for the invitation.
Oh, definitely. So I think it might be fun to start with the word spirituality. So having been in the academy and in the church and bridging that divide, do you see any commonalities today when we use the word? Because I think in every one of these conversations, I realize each discipline and each person's experience brings different baggage with that concept.
Yeah, I mean, of course, the root of the word spirit, spiritus, it connotes all kinds of different things for different people. From my perspective as a Lutheran Christian, a progressive Christian, an eco-feminist Christian, and someone who has served as a pastor and now teaches preaching and worship at a seminary. The way I understand spirituality is the pursuit of that which breathes life into us. So when we think about the Hebrew word ruach, which was the word used in the first chapter of Genesis to describe God's breath moving over the water, and then the breath being blown into Adam, the first human, and enlivening it, giving it life, and nephesh, that breath of life that goes in all things. It's that divinely inspired breath that animates us, that makes us want to connect with the holy, with the sacred. However that manifests, that can happen in nature, it can happen in a house of worship, it can happen in a conversation like we're having right now, it can happen in the sacraments, it can happen in any number of ways. But I want to say that the way people usually distinguish spirituality from religion is that spirituality is something that is much more personal, usually something that is done on an individual basis, whereas religion is the corporate understanding of how we relate to the divine and in all of its manifestations. So I think that religion can have spirituality within it. And I think that spirituality can exist apart from religion. But I will say, as a pastor, what I ideally like to see is a fusion of both. I think we can do more together than we can do alone. And so I'm interested in spirituality, both from an individualistic perspective, but also in an interpersonal and in a communal, corporate, congregational sense of the word.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. And when you think about that, the ideal of of religion supporting spirituality and spirituality enlivening religion, at the present moment, the future of spirituality and its place in relationship to religion is shifting. There's so many dramatic changes, and the institutions, those vocationally called to serve, the regular members that are engaged. How would you describe the kind of religious landscape and all the shifts and the way it's starting to impact human beings engaging in spiritual, questioning and that kind of stuff?
That's a great question. The shifting landscape of the relationship between religion and spirituality, I think now I've been ordained for, let's see, when was I ordained? I was ordained in 2000, so more than 20 years now. And I remember when I first started out in ministry, we would have conversations in our clergy groups about the fact that it seemed that the vocation, or I should say the profession of ordained ministry, seemed to be in jeopardy. Now, this was 2 decades ago, where congregations couldn't sustain and maintain a professional class of spiritual leaders. There wasn't enough money to maintain the buildings and the salary and the health insurance and all of that. And a lot of anxiety around what is it going to look like. And we spent all this time, money, energy to become this, a pastor, a clergy person. Is there even going to be a place for us? So I think over the last 20 years, we've seen a huge shift towards bivocational ministry, where clergy are doing other things to supplement what they're doing in their congregations in order to have enough money to survive. We're also seeing the rise of lay leaders, however that looks for different denominations, where a congregation identifies a person within their midst that they want to give them some theological education to help guide this congregation and be a spiritual leader. But it's only for this particular place and time. We're not training this person and then sending them off. So there's much more of a local a raising up of leaders for a particular time and place. And you see that especially for congregations of minoritized communities, immigrant communities. And so you're seeing education of theological education for those spiritual leaders as well. And then finally, I think that we're also seeing just that the corporate aspect of church is in some ways, it's tried very hard to help sustain and maintain a structure for pastoral leadership, but there are many factors that have led to the breakdown of denominations, which I hope we talk about in our conversation today, because I think it's indicating some serious systemic issues within corporate, and I mean that in both sense of the words, corporate religion that are going to have huge impacts, I think, on religion and spirituality going forward.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. No, but before we pick up the denominational, the big picture, I would be interested in how you see a change in your students. If you look back early in your own theological education, time in a congregation, and then working with students, how has the person entering vocational ministry or training for vocational ministry, how has their understanding of their task as a spiritual leader, a steward of a religious tradition, it changed in response to the external changes that you're pointing at?
Yeah, I don't think there's one universal way to look at it, but I can tell you that there are different kinds of students with different kinds of interests in the vocation of ministry than I saw when I was going through seminary. So, for example, I do think there remains the student who is interested in the Master of Divinity track. I got my undergraduate degree. I feel called to ministry. I want to serve in a church full time. That's what I'm going for. And that's still sort of the bread and butter of most theological education. But we're also seeing, as I mentioned earlier, more bivocational pastors who maybe do other things. Maybe they're in social work, maybe they're in the corporate world, maybe they teach. There's lots of other professions that a pastor can do in addition to serving a congregation on a part-time basis. So we're seeing more of that arise. We're also seeing, so at least at my seminary, and I would say in the data that I've seen from the Association of Theological Schools, ATS, a rise in non-MDiv degrees or degree seeking students. So certificate students or masters in pastoral studies that require less hours to have the training, give them just enough to be equipped, but not the full-blown MDiv. So we're seeing a shift in that way. The other thing that I'm noticing is more interest in students being able to connect with the social issues and the communal issues in their area. So connecting food and faith, or how does faith speak to issues around domestic violence? How do we see faith and environmental issues interacting? So wanting to be equipped for issues that are affecting people at the local level and the community level, there's more of an interest in that as well.
Mm-hmm. Now, in our some of the previous conversations we've had on the podcast, which people should go check them out, one of the things that you brought up that has struck me is how through the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, a lot of the political energy within the church was led by like intentionally politicizing faith leaders, and then they exercise their congregations. But as our identity in the States has shifted, now it works the other way around in a growing number of congregations, that politics are upstream of what's happening in the congregation. So now ministers are feeling either forced into silence around certain issues because of their congregation, or their congregation's looking at them like, you know what team we're pulling for. Like, tell us God is on our side. And you're right, like in some sense, if we took a big picture, we'd want to demonstrate that the kind of tribal energies that are running through culture are bad for the spiritual life of a nation or a religion, right? But as someone who's put a lot of time in engaging those clergy and working with congregations, how would you describe the energy in that shift, and what kind of challenge it plays for thinking of hosting a spiritually hospitable space in a congregational level?
That's a great question, because it seems that the prevailing wisdom right now is that divisiveness is making it more difficult to be a pastor, to be in a congregation. And at the same time, what I want to say is the polarization is actually being in some ways manufactured. And it's bad, but it might not be as bad as we think. Because when I have trained pastors and lay leaders in deliberative dialogue, which is a form of civil discourse that brings people together to have challenging conversations, challenging but respectful conversations about social issues, the process that we use helps people to discern how they came to the opinions that they did, or the beliefs that they did, through personal narrative and what's at stake for them, and then to examine pros and cons of different approaches to an issue, but also to find what are the things that we find we actually have in common, what are our shared values. And once we come through this process, people realize, wow, we actually have more in common than we thought. So why did we think that we were so opposed to each other? And what I think we have to recognize is that there are forces going on in our culture, in society, that are benefiting from us believing the narrative that we are so polarized and we are so divided. And when we challenge that to say, okay, there are a lot of differences, But can we look at what we actually have in common? That, because that leads more towards deep listening, um, empathy, peace, nonviolence, and is a lot less sexy than war and conflict and tension. And there's not as, you can't generate as much funding for yourself if things are at peace. So I think we have to look at who's benefiting from saying that we're so polarized and we're so divisive, and challenge that to say, yeah, let's look at this from a different angle and find out actually what we have in common.
That's I mean, that's really a hopeful response. And I think part of it is in congregations, the what it is you end up focusing on when it's driven by the where you are, the context you're in, the people that are gathering. You can find things to be deeply engaged in life-giving ways with the world that aren't us responding to the anxieties and tribal outbursts at kind of 40,000 feet. And I think that the part of the difficulty of religious life coming out of COVID-19 and the impact where it broke up us actually getting together and then put us in front of screens that are generating income by keeping our attention, by getting us wound up, right? Like so much of that dynamic of who's benefiting from this story and this anger is such an important question. And I think one of the things that immediately come to mind in you sharing that is, what would it mean for us that are leading congregations to help people recognize that one of the essential spiritual practices for our digitally mediated age is just that, not giving our anxiety and fear and energy to people that want to colonize it for the attention economy, and then animate it for means that don't build up our communities.
Exactly. And I think the way, like if a pastor wanted to speak to that, one of the ways they could do that is to point back to stories in scripture where, to say, this is not the first time the people of faith have had to deal with this kind of thing. Divisiveness animated all of Genesis. I mean, like you look at the dysfunction of these families, and you look at the animosity between Israel and the surrounding nations. I mean, there's a lot of terrible rhetoric in there about what we should do to people who are different from us. And yet you also see other voices saying, if you've got a foreigner in your midst, welcome them like they're your own family. You need to treat them with respect. You need to you need to remember where you came from, what you've been through, and pay it forward. And so when we see that, okay, this is, we've got a template here to help us think about how do we want to respond. And some of what we see in scripture is descriptive and some of it is prescriptive. I think that's one of the most helpful things that a pastor can do, is point out the differences between what's descriptive and what's prescriptive. And or at least maybe if they are not even sure, to say, let's have a conversation about that, so that we start to develop some critical thinking skills, which I think is also a part of spirituality, is being able to self-reflect, not get reactive, but to pause and say, okay, wait, let's take a step back. Let's use some of our spiritual practices, such as deep breathing and meditation and yoga, or whatever it is that helps you to not be reactive, to say, all right, what's going on here? How am I responding to this? How are others responding to this? Is this a choice that we're making consciously, or is this something that is being made for us in order to exploit, as you had talked about, the differences that are there, not just to exploit, but to capitalize on it and colonize it? So if we can, as a spiritual community, say, all right, let's take a moment and look around and see what's going on. I think that can put the brakes on some of this destructive rhetoric and destructive behaviors.
No, I think that's really good. One of the topics I'd love to hear you frame is, I mean, you've published and worked a lot and teach preaching, and one of the shifts that's taking place culturally is the number of people, even it hearing your sermon, who are familiar enough with the Christian tradition to understand what the well-educated, high quality, like what homiletics at peak discourse looks like. The number of people that will pick it up is so much smaller, that the awareness of the Christian tradition, biblical literacy, or whatever kind of language you do, is so much less, that there's a different kind of task, I think, for the preacher, if we as stewards of a tradition want to pass on the wisdom of the tradition. Then what we're doing in the preaching moment seems different than like when I learned and gave my first like youth Sunday sermon at a Baptist church in rural North Carolina, where everyone knew the Bible verses or knew they should have, and so they nodded anyway. Right. And so I could make allusions to all sorts of things. And then it's like, oh, he's following the big story. He's playing this out. Oh, that's quoting Paul. Oh, now I remember when I first moved to California, getting the looks on people's faces. And someone came up after it, deacon of the church. So who's the Abram? Abram. Like, is he one of the disciples? Is he connected to Noah? And I realized this is not, rural North Carolina, but that change is growing over and over again. And so I wonder, in asking the question of the future of spirituality, what is it like to be a steward of a wisdom tradition and then be handing it off when there's not the kind of awareness of the motifs, rituals, and symbols than previous generations? How do you see that task as the inviter and steward of a tradition?
Yeah, I always said to my preaching students all along, before COVID even hit, that you need to preach your sermon assuming that there is somebody in the congregation who has never stepped foot in your church or a Christian church ever. Preach to that person. Don't use the lingo. Don't use the code language. How are you going to use descriptive words? How are you going to tell the story in a way that does not assume insider language? And I remember many of my students saying, well, that just never happens. We never get visitors. I'm like, okay, that's a problem in and of itself. We'll talk about that later. But it's like, that's not the point. The point is, even your own parishioners who have been there sometimes for decades, you have to assume that they are, in a sense, visitors to this tradition, because what they might have learned back when they were doing confirmation, if that's part of your tradition, unless that's repeated regularly, they're going to forget these things. Unless you're doing a regular Bible reading program, like on a 3-year basis. And I'm not just talking about the lectionary that picks and chooses. I mean, you get about, 25 to 30% of the Bible in 3 years. That's not it. That's not what I'm talking about either. I'm talking about a regular, like, okay, we're reading through the entire book of James, and we're going to talk about it. Like, if you're not doing that on a regular basis, if you're not telling the story, then people don't have the template for you to put all of these things that you're saying in your sermon, and it's either going to float away or it's going to crumble. So you have to be very intentional about explaining the biblical story and your own context. And then when COVID hit, and people are seeing their sermons on Facebook getting hundreds of hits and watches, which is more than the 25 people that are in their congregation on a Sunday. They come back to me and they're like, Dr. Schade, you were right. Oh my gosh, there are people watching from all over the country, all over the world even. I said, see, now it's even more important for you to think beyond your little bubble and make this translatable to people from all different traditions, all over the world.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that the kinds of questions you take to the text are different? Like if you think of the driving questions that are kind of animating us as a species at our cultural historical moment and such in, say, the West or in the United States and that kind of thing, the kind of questions, even I like the image like of in the kind of questions that are coming if you're introducing people as visitors to the tradition are different. And
Mhm.
one of the real struggles, I think, is that those of us that ended up clergy are the ones that the institution really worked for. So many of us were the ones that like loved being a part of our congregations. We were like youth group junkies, volunteers in college groups, and then we're like, we're going to seminary, and we're like, this is amazing, and now I'm leading,
Yeah.
and just because it works so well for those that end up in charge of it at the congregational level and in a even more intense way in denominations, um
Mhm.
the true believers ended up in charge so often. And I wonder
Yes.
if that part of our task in looking at the changing shape of spirituality is giving a new kind of dignity to the struggles and questions of the whole, rather than kind of in Christendom, ministers always had that temptation to tell people what the real problem was and then come on with the gospel solution of sorts.
Mm. Yeah, I mean there are so many existential issues that our species faces that simply were not possible when the texts were written. Like it was not possible to literally destroy an entire planet. It was not possible to use weaponry to blow up an entire city. Like that wasn't possible. So we are literally dealing with questions about whether we will survive as a species. Now, I'm not saying that they weren't still worried about survival. I mean, when you look at Lamentations and you look at all of the texts written in exile where a people was worried about their own survival. Yes, but that happens over a period of time. It happens over a generation. It doesn't just happen, in an instant. So the urgency of those questions is something that we have to take seriously. And I have to say that, and I'm the parent of a high school student and a college student. And from what they're telling me, their friends and sometimes even they themselves don't feel that the church is adequately asking those questions or even providing space to have conversations about them. And so many of them are not seeing the church as relevant because we're not willing to talk about these really difficult questions.
And
So
and I
that means, so we've got our work cut out for us. I think, and I have these conversations with my kids all the time about, well, what would it look like? What needs to happen? And they've got great ideas about like, here's what we could do. But I often don't see the institutional and structural church equipping them to be able to do what they want to do, in terms of making spirituality and faith relevant for their questions at their age.
and I think one of the things you said that's just important to emphasize right there is the way you were using the word relevancy isn't how most kind of gurus of church relevancy use it, right? Like normally you hear relevancy and it's connected to putting in some program or including tech or updating your
Yeah.
music and all that kind of stuff. The relevancy is whether or not the kind of questions that are most pressing on us as a species in our time are the
Yes.
ones that most animate the community centered around good news, right? And that's the issue there is content. It's not the form. And so often
Bingo.
we
Yes.
we think relevancy is form, and so we're like, man, could we get a U2 cover band? And
Right. Right. I'll tell you, my kids just like, if they're going to sit down and listen to somebody preach for 12, 15, 20 minutes, they want to feel that they've gotten something that it's going to equip them to deal with the fact that the climate is changing so fast that species can't even adapt. Like, what does your sermon have to do with that? What does your sermon have to do with the fact that there's legislation now that makes it illegal to parent a child who is trans? What what is the church saying about that? I mean, what is it saying about Black and brown bodies who are continually exploited and killed simply because of the color of their skin? If you're not talking about those issues, then the young people that I am familiar with are not interested in just sitting there and listening to you pontificate about things that don't have any impact on how they're going to survive and help their community survive.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think one of the reasons that's difficult for those entrenched in religious institutions is religious institutions are in crisis mode. They're in survival
Absolutely.
mode. And when you're
Yes.
in that mode, whether it's trying to figure out how to handle a crisis in your family or your congregation or a denomination or a democracy, crisis mode is not built for like level-headed, long-term, deep values expressed thinking and acting. It's just not. And so I like when you think about the way those anxieties around institutional change and breakdown are shaping life at the congregational level, like I don't know, when you look at that predicament for denominations, what are the features of it that you think we need to address and get a hold of quickly, if we want to not squander, in some sense, the inheritance that many denominations are figuring out what to do with, be it with like both what they do with the people, but also what they do with the next generation. But then what do you do with land and property and investments and theological education? Like, anyway, yeah.
Yeah. Well, Lisa Cressman, in her book, The Gospel People Don't Want to Hear, Preaching Challenging Messages, talks about brittleness in congregations. And this happens for denominations as well. So when a system is stressed and it can't handle any more that you're trying to put on it, you'll see all kinds of signs of that brittleness, such as passive aggressive behavior or direct aggression or scapegoating or gaslighting or all of these really unhealthy behaviors. And when you're seeing that, you have to take a different tack for how you're going to be prophetic. And I don't mean prophetic as in telling the future, and I don't mean as in John the Baptist, you have to go out and wear a camel's hair coat and eat locusts for lunch. I'm talking about speaking truth in the midst of a very difficult situation, speaking spiritual truth to that. So I'm actually writing a book right now with my colleagues Jerry Sumney and Emily Askew, a preaching textbook where we, at the end of the book, we suggest 3 different approaches for these kinds of sermons. So you can either be the gentle prophet, the invitational prophet, or the robust prophet. And if you're in a situation where you yourself are feeling vulnerable, or your congregation is vulnerable, and the relationship is stressed, and there are other external factors that lead into stress, then your best approach is gentle prophet. And that one of the strategies for that in that mode is lament. Lament means to give voice to the emotions that people are feeling around these issues. Because simply giving voice to them means that we are willing to listen, we are willing to make space for them, and we're saying that God listens to this. And once we can name those pain points for people, God can work with that. We can work with that. But unless we're willing to be honest about where our struggles are, what our fears are, what has hurt us, unless we're willing to be honest about that and feel safe enough to do so, then that pain and that fear and that anger it's not going to go away. It's just going to manifest itself in really unhealthy ways. So a sermon that says, I don't have all the answers, but I'm really interested in the questions, and I'm really interested in hearing what it's like for you in this. And then after the sermon, making space to listen is a place to start. It's not where we end, but we've got to start with the emotional aspect of things when we're dealing with that kind of stress and brittleness.
I think that's I love the typology. I can't wait to hear more about it. And I think it's really helpful because oftentimes when we as leaders are in situations where our like deepest passions we think are going to not be heard or are going to be resisted, then I think it's sometimes out of weakness that we become the robust fire slinging prophet, so that then we can go down on behalf of truth. And a lot of the tension of leadership is realizing that you're not leading when you're so far away from your congregation that you're experienced as an enemy and not the leader.
Yes.
And realizing that requires a type of attentiveness to the people that are there and the context, and then realizing like what are the ways in your leadership you can join God's invitation for us as a congregation and as a church at large to partner more deeply in God's mission.
Absolutely. Because when I say robust prophet, I don't mean, again, like the fire and brimstone kind of person. I'm talking about somebody who knows that their congregation it's already in a healthy place. They've already done a lot of work around this. They're self-aware. They're, financially, they're feeling pretty good. And they feel equipped to actually do some of the work. So even that is like, you're always trying to align with the people and not against them. Because I'm not saying that we don't call out sin, structural sin, whatever. We have to do that. But it's better to be able to say, this is how I'm struggling with it. Does that relate to you as well? Like, do you ever feel like that? So that you're modeling for people what it looks like to be self-critical, self-reflective, and then to say, okay, so where might we go from here? And then gently move into, all right, there's this Bible story of this person who went through this and had to be called to account. And what do you think about when you hear this story, right? So there are different sermon forms, different strategies, tactics that you can integrate the angst of this time, name it, frame it theologically and biblically, so that you give people some tools to be able to say, okay, right, this is how we understand ourselves to be as people of faith. These are things that we can learn from our spiritual ancestors. Let's give it a try, because what we're doing now is not working, or is not working for all people. So let's see if we can try something else.
Oh, I think that's a wonderful invitation. Well, thank you for hanging out and sharing. I've really enjoyed getting to talk to you again. I hope everyone that's been a part of the summit connects with you. Where should we direct people if they're wanting to find out more about your work, and where to go to check out LTS and such?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I blog at Patheos. I'm the Eco Preacher blogger, so you can Google that. I'm also on, you can follow my Twitter account. Just look up LeahSchade. And I'm also on Facebook. You can follow my author page, again, LeahSchade. And you can also, you can audit classes at Lexington Theological Seminary. And so if you want to sit in on a preaching class with me or an intro to worship class with me, you can, just go to Lexington Theological Seminary, Google that, and go to admissions, and you can see what our classes are, and reach out there and say, hey, I'd love to sit in and learn more. We always welcome auditors in our classes.